Hey, Dad. We are back. We took a little bit of time off. I went out on the lake for Memorial Day. I got tan a little bit. The day before this airs is Father's Day, so happy Father's Day. Weekly Dad News. It lines up great. We are following on the end of the former president of the United States being convicted on 34 felony charges. And we also had the son of the sitting president convicted on a felony charge. And so I wanted to talk about a father and son duo that kept getting in trouble, and it started about 10 years ago. Today, we're going to talk about how the law treats people, why it treats people that way, and revisit a case that was bizarre as all get out, but highlights why the law is not always effective. I don't have a gavel, so I got a hammer. Let's go with the case of Cliven and Ammon Bundy and their bag of dicks. Justice in America, Father's Day edition, Weekly Dad News. To give some shape and scope to where we're going with this, let's talk about the stack of organizations that own land in the United States. There's the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife. There's the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Forestry, National Parks. There's all these different federal agencies that own land directly in the United States. Early on, as we were buying land from France and we were taking it from Mexico in wars and just doing all kinds of things to get more land, we'd often take that land and as quick as we could privatize it. We were getting people out and having little farms. We were getting people out and having timber. And end of the 18th century, we had the serious odds of having a timber famine, which meant that we were using timber at such a clip and producing it so slowly that we were going to have to turn to Canada or other providers to get the lumber we needed for the expansion of the railroads, the increase in the number of mines, the building of all of the houses that were coming with the population boom. So when we looked at that, we started looking to these other agencies to hold on to the land and kind of conserve it for other purposes. The Bureau of Land Management is one such organization. They're there to make sure that parts of land that are collectively owned by all of us, by the United States, are put to their best purpose. And that's where we get things like mining and drilling rights, exploration for oil. We get timber rights. We get grazing rights. And we also get conservation efforts, things like Joshua trees and the desert tortoise, for example, as well as kinds of owls. And you'll hear about a bird or a butterfly that people think it's a little too much to preserve. So the Bureau of Land Management owns over 80% of the land in Nevada. It's by far the largest amount of land owned by the BLM in any state. Utah is a distant second with around 60-something%. But the reason it has so much of that land is because there's not that much in Nevada. It's mostly desert that can be used for mining. There's some places that can be used for grazing cattle. And there's other huge swaths where the land is so sensitive that the best use of it is conservation of that environment to protect an animal or to keep that environment safe and thrivable for all the little things that live there. Our story of the elder Bundy, now this is Cliven Bundy, starts way back. He traces his ancestry to the early Mormons that came to Las Vegas and put up the Mormon fort in Las Vegas as one of the first settlements here in Nevada. His family bought the ranch that he currently works in the late 1940s. His parents bought it in the late 1940s and he inherited it. And he is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I don't bring that up lightly. I bring that up because there is a part of their theology that has direct bearing on this. And that's this dominion piece. Utah uses more water per capita than almost any other state. And part of the reason it is that way is because they use water both for farming and agricultural purposes. But even where it's a desert, and it is a desert, a large part of Utah is a desert. I know a lot of people think of Salt Lake City and skiing and those mountains, but the southern half of Utah is really a desert. But in the Mormon way of thinking, they need to have grass, they need to have lawns, they need to take control and dominion over the earth. So they have these lawns that are lush. If their neighbors get fake grass, they get made fun of by their other neighbors and kind of ostracized a little bit for having weird grass, plastic grass, instead of doing what God wants and having all that grass. So you see this line of thinking in the Mormon theology. For Cliven Bundy, he thinks and has thought for a long time that states have superior rights to the federal system and that individuals have superior rights to the states based on the ordination of God and their theology. So, Cliven Bundy, he's been working that land for a long time. And in 1993, he said, I'm not going to pay the grazing fees to graze my animals on the land because he changed the rules. Prior to that, he had been paying the federal government a very nominal fee. It's super cheap to pay the government to graze your cattle on federal lands, much cheaper than owning and maintaining thousands of acres to graze hundreds and hundreds of thousands of heads of cattle. So he'd been paying that, and it had been no big deal until in 1993, when they changed the rules around a little piece right here, right in the corner. They changed rules around this little piece because they're trying to protect the habitat of the desert tortoise. And that directly affects where people can graze in Bunkerville. And it changes the amount of grazing they're going to allow. So basically, they just shift this stuff around and go, okay, now in this case, instead of having this many head of cattle wandering around, we're going to cut it way back because we're hitting droughts, we're hitting issues, we're hitting problems with having enough vegetation for the desert tortoises to eat. We're having problems with this strange, it's this virus they started getting. It's super contagious. And other animals can carry it, but don't have it. And so there's lots of things that are kind of messing this up, right? So they go, okay, we're gonna limit the amount of animals that can be in there. We don't want you having as many animals as you have in there, Mr. Bundy. And Mr. Bundy goes, I've long thought that you shouldn't have any say in this at all. I don't think that this land should be federal. I think that this land should belong to the state. So I'm not gonna pay you anymore anyway. So in 1993, he stops paying. He has the money to pay. And the biggest proof of that is that in 1994, he sent a check to Clark County in the state of Nevada to pay for his grazing fees, what he would have paid if it had been federal. And they sent it back to him. They go, we don't have jurisdiction to accept this. We don't have anything set up to do grazing. We're a county municipality. We're local. We're super local. So since they sent it back, Cliven Bundy stops paying. And once he stops paying, he begins to rack up not only the debt for the annual grazing fees of his cattle, but also the late fees, the fines for lack of communication, the fines for not reporting, all these different fines add up too. So by the time 2014 runs around, this is 10 years ago, he owes over $1 million. It's the largest debt for grazing fees ever in US history. It's 4 or 5 times the next several combined. It's massive. It's just because he thinks he shouldn't be paying the federal government. At most, he should be paying the state government. And I think somewhere in there, he was thinking, this land is God's land. It's not being used by anybody. I should be able to use it however I wish because that's how this works. So on March 27, 2014, after giving him notice and saying, hey, you have this much unpaid, we're sending you to debt collections, basically. And if you don't get your cattle off, not only are you fined, but we're going to confiscate your cattle because they're grazing illegally on federal land. March 27, 2014, the BLM began rounding up Bundy's cattle. They closed off 145,000 acres, put signs up around 145,000 acres that said this land is closed. It cannot be used for grazing. It cannot be used for off-highway activity. It cannot be used for anything right now. And by doing that and rounding up the cattle, Bundy got mad. When he got mad, he started a call to arms, really. He said, hey, they're doing this. They're going to take my cattle. And if the government can take my cattle, they're going to come for your guns. They're going to come for your house. They're going to come for your stuff next. This is an overreach by the government. And a couple of different groups that are organized put out a call to arms, as well as Bundy family members. Remember, the Mormon community is very tight and supportive of each other. They often have large families. So just in Bundy's immediate family, you have a dozen people showing up to support him, plus support roles, making food, taking care of kids. In addition to that, you have two militia groups heed the call. And you've heard of both of these groups in connection with January 6th, and that is the 3%ers and the Oath Keepers. These two militia groups are pretty far right and often dangerously inflammatory towards the government and pushing towards conflict and armed revolution against the government. They show up and they've got guns, they had people in sniper posts, they had Kevlar vests, a bunch of them were on horseback, and you have this standoff between them and the federal government. And the federal government's sitting on one side, and Cliven Bundy and his group are sitting on the other side, and it becomes a national kind of rallying cry for what at that time was the nascent Tea Party movement, along with the 3%ers and the Oath Keepers. This is great publicity for them and helps get them more members. Remember, too, that in 2014, even though we're well far away from Waco, the specter of Waco hangs over any armed actions by the federal government in force, especially when they're facing off over something like land rights, right? So, armed conflict is not the government's goal. They want people to follow the law, and they have mechanisms to do so. They have the courts, and they have the police, and they have the government enforcement agencies. So they go, okay, we don't want to shoot people. We don't want them to shoot at us. So the newly appointed BLM director was Neil Corns. He decided, I'm gonna release the cattle and de-escalate the situation, which he did, and then he promptly brought suit against them. He said, all right, we're gonna file suit and bring this up to you. So that court case was filed 2 years later, right? So this happens in March of 2014. And in February of 2016, Cliven Bundy, Ryan Bundy, Ammon Bundy, and others were indicted in the U.S. District Court for the U.S. District Court for the District of Nevada for their roles in the 2014 Bundy standoff. They were charged with 16 felony counts. One of those counts was conspiracy to commit an offense against the United States. One count was conspiracy to impede or injure a federal officer. 4 counts of using and carrying a firearm in relation to a crime of violence, 2 counts of assault on a federal officer, 2 counts of threatening a federal law enforcement officer, 3 counts of obstruction by the due administration of justice, and 2 counts of interference with interstate commerce by extortion, and 1 count of interstate travel in aid of extortion. That was more for the people that came into town to help them out. This prosecution made mistakes, because all of the charges are lumped together. That way they can have the conspiracy stuff too. So all these charges are lumped together, and against all these defendants, they found that there were 6 pieces of evidence that the prosecution withheld from the defense. So Gloria Navarro declared a mistrial in the government's conspiracy case against them. She ruled the prosecution violated the defendant's due process rights, which these are Brady violations. They're about disclosure. The prosecution's errors were not only egregious, but they were willful, meaning the government knew or should have known that the defense should have access to that evidence, and prejudicial. And while not necessarily exculpatory, it means it doesn't clear them. This doesn't say they didn't do it, but this undermines the confidence of the outcome of trial. So the mistrial gets in, and then the case gets thrown out. It's dismissed with prejudice. You can't bring it again. So they get away with it. But they don't get away with it in like, there wasn't enough of a case. They get away with it because the system of justice we have demands that the prosecution and the defense know what the other side is doing and presenting so they can adequately prepare. There's not a lot of gotcha moments in court cases. If there are, they usually come through when witnesses are discussing things. So while we like to malign our justice system when we don't like the outcome, I would argue right now that this dismissal was warranted. If you're the prosecution and you're working for the United States of America and you have those resources at your disposal, you don't have to withhold it to have a strong case. Keep that in mind. So Cliven Bundy's son, Ammon Bundy, is in this same mindset as his dad, but being younger, he's more active with talking to militia groups like the Oath Keepers and the 3%ers. And this whole resistance piece, the armed resistance stuff, is very much in line with the West. We had a series of rebellions called the Sagebrush Rebellions in the 70s and 80s, and they were Western states pushing back against federal land policies. There's been this friction with the people that are in the area and feel like they're going to use the land more effectively, and the people that are from on high in DC telling them what they can do. That argument is ongoing. It's still a discussion we can have. It's still a discussion that needs having as long as we have these pieces of land that are owned and administered by the federal government, but are allowed for use for both state and personal reasons, right? Ammon is on the side of armed rebellion. He's one of those guys that he discusses the Constitution and the Bible in lockstep when discussing how this works. And on January 2nd, 2016, Ammon Bundy takes his shot. There were a couple of people at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge that had been convicted on arson charges, or brought up on arson charges, for burning trash in the wildlife refuge. You can't do that. If you want to, you have to get a permit, because again, this is federally administered national land in a state. In this case, it's in Oregon. And it's not only in Oregon and kind of neat and cool, it's also one of the darkest places in the United States, where there's so little light coming from miles around that it is considered a darkness preserve. We have one in northern Nevada as well. There's these spots where towns are so far away, there's no streetlights, there's no buildings, that you can, in the middle of the night when the moon isn't out, look up and see the entire galaxy with your naked eye, stretching across. It's amazing. I haven't been there, but I have had that experience deep in the desert. It's humbling. It's a gorgeous thing. The Malheur Reservation is one of those places. It is also a place that is sacred to the Native Americans that used to make their home there. So there's parts of it that are shared with the Native Americans to allow them to come back and do things on the land that they used to do and go visit places that they used to be part of their heritage. And so it has this kind of solemnity to it. It definitely has a peace. There's parts of Oregon where the trees grow so big and it is so wild. You don't know that you're in the year 2024. You lose that sense and you become kind of more in commune with nature. Those two guys, Dwight and Stephen Hammond, that had the arson charges, put out the call because they know the Bundys. They know the 3%ers. They know the Oath Keepers. And they put out the call and they go, this is garbage. And Ammon organizes a group to go and take over the Malheur Reservation. They take over the main parks building that administrates it. They set up fortifications along the road. They set up watches. And they literally occupy, like an invading army, a parks building. Now they're doing it for what they say are to demonstrate the problem with government overreach and fight back against it after they've convicted these two guys of burning stuff in the park, which they say the government shouldn't own or administer the park. So they're not even saying we didn't do it and we didn't burn it. They're just saying we don't believe you have jurisdiction to say that they were burning this stuff in the park. It's this really kind of complicated argument. And when you ask them what they want, they say they want all of this land given back. They want all of this land removed from federal jurisdiction and given to state jurisdiction, or just allowed for the use of everybody that wants to use it. They also demanded the release of the Hammonds. So they want the Hammonds released and a transfer of the land from the federal government to the state government. They called for supporters to join the cause, and the initial standoff lasts 40 days. So for 40 days they're there, and they keep getting more and more people coming to their cause. Now, since they were occupying a well-known building of which the address is public knowledge, and because of the way they were doing the occupation and the way that the federal forces were not directly confronting them, mail kept coming. They got deliveries from Amazon through the post. They got deliveries. People would send them support. They'd send them money. They'd send them food and that kind of things. But in a beautiful act of protest, many members of the public started sending them dildos. They famously received not only just a ton of dildos in the mail, they got a bag of dicks. They were sent a literal bag of dicks. So they kept complaining and saying, stop sending us this stuff. We don't know why you're wasting your money on hate mail, which shows that they missed the point of not only their protest, but of that counter protest, telling that they were kind of being a bag of dicks. So they get this, they get all the things, and it goes on for those 40 days. It comes to an end when there's a traffic stop, and in that traffic stop, you have both Ammon and his brother Ryan in a car, and another car that has a couple of militants in it. One of them was Robert Lavoy Finicum. And this is important because during that traffic stop, when they're arresting the Bundys, Finicum, allegedly, this has never been adjudicated, but Finicum reached for a gun and was shot, and he died of his wounds. So this confrontation does end in violence, but not at the compound that they're holding. It's a traffic stop down the road. But now with Ammon and his brother Ryan and a couple of the militants in custody, the standoff goes on for about 2 more weeks, so like 14 more days. And then it kind of, finally they surrender on February 11th, 2016. 27 militants were arrested and faced various federal charges, including conspiracy to impede federal officers. This one goes to court and is adjudicated. They refuse to enter pleas, so not guilty is entered for them. They're being just very difficult against the court system itself. Bundy, kind of being a punk, during the arraignment goes, all right, fine, you read the whole indictment. So they have to read 64 pages. These are 6 or 7 pages that I go through. 64 pages is gonna take some time to read aloud in court. That trial ends in a not guilty verdict. So both Bundys in this case, the elder and the younger, have gone through the court system and stepped away clean for defying federal forces. Now, that's not to say that their reputations aren't hurt in some circles, their relationships with government entities aren't strained, but they all walk away. A bunch of the others do go to jail. A bunch of the other people at Malheur go to jail. A bunch of people at the original Bunkerville standoff had charges and went to jail. But the 2 guys that organized these, they walk away. That comparison is where we get to when we start talking about like, oh, how does this system work? How is it even being fair? How is Trump being charged? How is Hunter being charged? These are political charges. These are machinations. The decision of who and when to prosecute is a political decision every time. What we would like to see as citizens is something that makes it look like justice is being served. So when we see these things where the people who committed them do not say they did not commit them, they think they were right and they think it was just and they think justice is served on their side, and they get acquitted or the case gets sent out through a mistrial, it looks like they're getting the justice they wanted. Well, on our side, we're looking at it and going, well, do I have to occupy a wildlife refuge to get justice in something else? How does this work? How do we put this together in our court system? Why is it that people that are obviously guilty, and not only obviously guilty, but know that they're guilty, say they did it, but that they aren't guilty because the system is wrong, and the system loses? So that kind of sits in the back of my mind while I look at where these 2 guys are now, because this is very much like what Trump did for most of his life, where he just sued everybody he could into oblivion, and people just kind of stood on the side and went, we're not going to get in a fight with him because it's too expensive. We're not going to get in a fight with him because it's going to run our court through the ringer. And that's the question that keeps coming up while I'm reading these, right? Is Trump spent $100 million in the last couple of years on legal fees because he's got so many court cases, but he keeps losing the trial. It's just a stalling tactic. The mistakes made by the prosecution during Cliven and his son's trial and the others are forced errors. They're their own errors. You got turned around and you kicked a goal into the wrong side. You threw a basket for the opposing team. Like, these are things that you should know better. Ammon's the one that I think makes the most sense, because at least it went to a jury trial. And in that jury trial, they made a decision as a jury on the preponderance of the evidence. And I can respect that because it actually got there. I don't agree with the outcome, and I haven't read all the court records to understand the arguments or why it happened that way. But I understand that that's how our system works, and I'm okay with that. But what it does is it empowers these people to continue acting in the ways they've been acting, even though it's known to be criminal. It just hasn't been adjudicated criminally. So it brings us to where we're at now. You've got Cliven Bundy. As of September of 2023, he was still grazing his cattle on federal land. The Bureau of Land Management continues to not make any effort to stop him. I think after the humiliation of the first court case and the optics of standing there against an occupying or resisting force, make them think that it's not worth it. The juice isn't worth the squeeze, so to say. But from a justice point of view, that doesn't feel right and it doesn't sit right, because we want to adjudicate all the things and have a just world. We have this bias where we believe the world is just. So for some of us, the only way that it remains just is if they are punished after, if they have to face their maker. But in their theology, they're doing the right thing. So that one doesn't even kind of hold. Ammon Bundy. So Cliven Bundy was always going to graze his cattle. He wasn't as into the direct activism, the Malheur stuff, the militias, as his son was. Ammon Bundy was very much in that. Ammon Bundy ended up helping out an associate. This associate was starving his child by all reports. And it was because he was starving his child that the hospital where they brought the child took him from him and said, we're going to feed this child until they're healthy. The child was described as being malnourished so badly that it looked like children the nurse had served in Haiti, where they had their bellies distended and their necks and limb were very thin. They were just severely malnourished. I took the child away and helped it get better. We're planning on releasing it back to the parents after an investigation by CPS. Ammon Bundy and a bunch of his buddies, a bunch of his goons, get together and start harassing the hospital and the staff for taking the child. And the harassment of the staff is so egregious that they are found guilty in a civil trial for harassment, and they have a $52 million fine levied against them in this civil trial. So he's on the hook for $50 million. Not only that, but he fails to show up for a bunch of things. There are currently warrants out for his arrest in Idaho. And for a while, nobody really knew where he is. He pops up every once in a while, and early in 2024, he posted something to Facebook, and there was still a location tag on it. So like, okay, he's back in Utah. So they kind of know where he's at. But right now, there's warrants for contempt because he just keeps not showing up to any of the trials. He hasn't paid any of the funds that are due. He's kind of ignoring the whole thing, which is not a good idea. This is one that's easier for the federal government to keep coming after you on, and it's also one that's easier to prove in court. So Ammon Bundy is kind of low-key in hiding with a warrant out for him, but I would argue that his earlier acquittal made him believe that he was righteous and just, and he would not have to pay any fines or do any criminal time for his harassment of these employees. His behavior was warranted based on the outcome of his previous behavior, and that can be problematic for the judicial system as well. Remember the two militia groups that I was talking about that came and helped out? One was the Oath Keepers. Oath Keepers played a part in the January 6th assault on the Capitol. Many of them are in jail now, including one of their leading organizers, Elmer Stewart Rhodes. He got 18 years for seditious conspiracy. The Three Percenters, which is, again, it's a pretty far-right militia organization, they, even being far right, after January 6th, they were so surprised, shocked, and kind of appalled by what happened that they went ahead and they dissolved the U.S. chapter of the Three Percenters after January 6th. So that's somewhere in February of that year. They said, yeah, no. A bunch of them are in jail as well. As far as our little buddy, the desert tortoise, their numbers are still in decline. They aren't able to get true readings in a lot of places because there's not enough to count. They've declined almost 90% since the 1970s from their former population. We're seeing slight signs of resurgence in some places, but nowhere near what their population numbers used to be. I saw one where I was out hiking the other day. We introduced it to the dog. But all of this stuff, this balance between federal government, state government, and individual governance, like what you're going to have, what you're going to do, plays into the discussions we're having right now about what to do with these things that are illegal, what to do with these things where if you bring a court case, it's going to take a really long time to flesh it out. But if we don't do it, the sins of the father carry on to the son, and the son will behave in the same way. With that said, and it being the day after Father's Day, I'm pretty glad that I act like my dad. I'll take these. I'm glad I don't have those. Happy Father's Day from all of us here at Weekly Dad News. Bye, Dad. Love you.